Hi, everyone. Welcome to our Q2R podcast. I'm Jana, and I lead Quantum's AI ML recruitment practice and spend my days working with the teams building real-world applications of emerging tech. Today's topic is from PoC to production, and it's one of the most common pain points that I hear about across all the industries. GenAI demos are everywhere, but production-grade deployments are rare. To dig into this, I am joined by Sean Huberman, head of R&D and AI engineering at Sanofi. Sean holds a PhD in electrical engineering and brings over a decade of experience designing and scaling complex engineering systems. Sean, welcome. And let's kick it off with a quick intro. Can you tell us a little bit more about your work?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you very much for having me. So traditionally, drug discovery and vaccine development is a very long process end to end. So from early molecule discovery through the preclinical trial process, and then all the way through the actual clinical trials and regulatory approval, it typically takes on the order of 12 to 15 years before a therapy actually reaches a patient, which is a very, very long time. So Sanofi's kind of set an ambitious goal of cutting that time roughly in half down to about 6 years by 2030. And a core part of that strategy is leveraging AI and machine learning to accelerate how therapies are discovered, developed, and tested across the entire pipeline. My team works very closely with data scientists and computational scientists and R&D stakeholders to turn AI and ML ideas into real production-grade products, where our objective is to make sure that products don't die at the proof of concept phase and are actually deployed, governed, and used at scale.
Yes. So let's start then with the big picture part in we're seeing. So lots of flashy demos and POCs, but very few systems making it into production. What's your take on why that is? Why are so many GenAI or agent-based projects getting stuck at the proof of concept phase?
Yeah, that's certainly the big question in the industry right now. And I think my opinion on that, and actually before I kind of take it on a little bit further, I just want to make note that all the views that I'm sharing today are my own and do not represent the official views or policies or positions of Sanofi as general. But my opinion on that is that I think that a lot of times what's happening when people are developing GenAI based solutions is that they're optimizing for more of a compelling demo than they are for a system with production constraints. At that POC stage, you can ignore a lot of very hard problems. Things like you can use a narrow slice of curated data, you can tolerate some flaky behavior, you can accept higher latency, more unpredictable costs, you can have more manual intervention, you can bypass things like governance and security reviews and compliance. You can hard code prompts and skip evaluations, and you can really rely on just one engineer sometimes to keep things running. And so oftentimes there's a bit of an ownership problem as well. So no one's really accountable for that user experience or the risk acceptance or the long-term roadmap. They're oftentimes built by innovation teams or individual engineers and not necessarily by durable product teams. So they oftentimes lack that user experience vision. They're not always clear about what systems will and will not do. And, oftentimes, like, it all looks fine in a demo, but a lot of that stuff can really become fatal in production.
Yes. So let's go then deeper into the engineering side. So once you moved past the prototype, what really changes in production? What are some of the core technical challenges that start to emerge? I think we already briefly touched on it, right, from the user perspective, right? So, like, yes, if you want just to elaborate a little bit more on that.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think the number one thing is that when you move into a production grade environment, things like reliability become non-negotiable. So you need to have deterministic failure modes, fallbacks, timeouts, human override paths. Things like agent loops that look very clever in a demo become very unacceptable when they hang, spiral, or silently fail. And so many of the concepts that are very well known in conventional systems are oftentimes a little less clear how they can be applied to GenAI systems. So things like conventional systems, software systems, you would use things like unit tests and integration tests to ensure a certain level of reliability in your code. And a lot of times that's not quite what happens in a GenAI type type environment, because it's a lot more complicated on how you actually would apply them in those cases. A lot of those things rely on deterministic behavior. I give a specific input. I know I'm going to get a specific output. I can run that test over and over and over. I'm going to get the exact same output. When you're dealing with some GenAI systems, you don't necessarily get the same output when you give the same input for the exact same parameters. So you need systems that are able to kind of leverage the concepts that were developed over many, many years for best engineering systems practices, but they need to be applied into a different way when dealing with GenAI systems. So you still need automated tests and golden data sets and regression detection and quality metrics that are tied to business outcomes. But you need to actually handle some of the lack of the deterministic nature of some of those data sets as part of your platform that you're building.
Right. And I think like when you prototype, and it's also like the scarcity of the resources sometimes you have, right? It's like you often dealing with really small, tight budgets, right? And
Absolutely.
You need to get a significant buy-in to allocate more resources to it. So no, that's great, Sean. And
there's a lot of complex aspects there as well, like things like basic prompt changes. If I just told you, oh, I just made a minor change to a prompt, how do you know if that's a major change to the application versus a minor change versus a revision? And it could have a massive output or change on the actual system behavior. Whereas like that's kind of one of those things where you need to make sure that those types of changes that could become breaking, you need to make sure that you have a provable behavioral stability in order to be able to support that kind of production grade kind of system. And a lot of times I think product design has to become actually a critical part of the system reliability itself. And that's something that is oftentimes very much overlooked. You need users to be able to understand when the system is confident versus when it's guessing. That needs to be built into the UI and like workflow patterns so that you can surface things like uncertainty, confidence, and failure states. You need to have things like explainability that's not just a compliance feature, but maybe a product feature, so that the user can actually tell when the outputs are reliable versus not reliable. And some of those are things that, again, like within a production grade environment is really, really important. Certainly on the kind of more on the maintenance side, things like observability become essential.
Right. There's just lots of moving pieces there, and like small changes, like you said, that they could make a drastic change in the application itself. And as you work for a multinational pharmaceutical and healthcare company, I'm sure it comes with some regulatory and enterprise constraints as well, right? You're not just dealing with technical side of the application, you also got privacy, compliance, and regulated workflows to navigate, right? How do you balance innovation in GenAI with those real world guardrails?
Yeah, those are aspects that in a regulated enterprise, things like governance it's not a tax on innovation. It's the type of thing that determines whether you're allowed to ship anything at all. And so designing governance into the architecture is something that has to be there from the start. It's not something you can kind of bolt in later. So that means things like clear data boundaries, auditability by default, explainability and controllability, which is some things I kind of mentioned before, but explainability is a product requirement. It's not just a regulatory one. So I think you need to make sure that users can understand why certain recommendations were made. And those are some things that help both build trust with an end user as well as reduce operational risk. Personally, I find that fully autonomous agentic systems are not really defensible in most regulated workflows today. Instead, I think you need to kind of design systems where there's kind of clear, explicit handoff points to humans, design overrides and confirmation of workflows or whatever the behavior might be from that agentic system. You design escalation paths when confidence is low. And you certainly need to handle things like security and access controls. And that's something that you mentioned before, but you need to treat it like an LLM, like in any other service. You need to enforce identity, permissions, encryption, network isolation. You don't let engineers kind of bypass the rules for speed.
No, absolutely. And it's also such a new field that there's still lots of unknown there, and especially in the bigger scale. And another hot topic right now is build versus buy. And I know you had some interesting takes on this. So what do you think about build versus buy decisions in the AI platform space? Any lessons learned or frameworks you like to use?
Yeah, I'd say honestly, neither pure build nor pure buy kind of really works at scale. And external platforms can be really, really useful for fast experimentation. They can be very good for prototyping, basic orchestration, early integration, but eventually you kind of outgrow them. And purely internal builds can be very expensive and very slow. And most teams don't need to reinvent basic LLM plumbing. So I find what works best is a bit of a hybrid approach. So you want to buy or adopt open tooling for commodity layers, things like basic orchestration or vector search and model access. But you want to build internal platform layers for enterprise specific or production critical things like data access and permissions, evaluation and regression testing, prompt and model versioning, cost control and usage policy enforcements, audit logging and compliance hooks, and then standardizing your deployment processes, your CI/CD, and that kind of stuff. I think one common mistake teams make is treating things like orchestration frameworks as the core of the system. I think the core of the system needs to be your governance, your evaluations, your data contracts, your operational reliability, your product integration. And like that's impacts how outputs are presented to users, how confidence and uncertainty are surfaced, how feedback is handled, and not just solved by just pure orchestration frameworks. So the orchestration layer is kind of the glue that pulls it all together, though.
Right. And when you're shifting from buy to build, like how really easy is that transition? Are you technically starting something from scratch, or you can still use that was already built?
Yeah, I think there's a couple key considerations there. One is obviously the amount of effort involved in you building that yourself as opposed to using the buy. But another factor is also the cost component. So when you are buying, obviously there's a cost factor associated with it. But oftentimes buying first and then having the opportunity to take your time to decide when you want to build internally, and you can roadmap for that, right? So that's something that doesn't necessarily have to be there day one, but it's something you can kind of build to kind of more in the long term. But I think the really important part of that build or versus, well, maybe not the build versus buy, but the buy element specifically does factor into that cost factor. And that cost factor it's not something to be completely ignored, specifically when we're talking about a production grade environment. Cost control kind of becomes a design constraint. So it is important to make sure that we're architecturing kind of bounded context sizes and caches and batching and model tiers and all that kind of important stuff. And a lot of times what happens is kind of, we were talking about in the PoC stage and when people start to try to accelerate stuff into more of a production environment, a lot of times most teams only discover cost blow up after things have been deployed. And when it's either politically or technically much harder to fix. So having a good idea or assessment of that as you're kind of moving through the early stages of a project and it seems to be picking up some steam before it hits that production kind of level, will oftentimes set yourself up for success kind of in the long run and kind of helps you plan that when do I want to transition from buy to build a little bit more elegantly.
Perfect. And if you had to give one piece of advice to an AI leader who's trying to move GenAI into production this quarter, what would that be?
Yeah, I would say stop funding GenAI POCs that are not designed to survive production gates. I think
it's pretty obvious.
Well, you think that, but a lot of times, somebody has an interesting idea, they create a rough prototype or something, and somebody gets excited about it, and then it gets accelerated through, and those are still good things. You don't want to limit the innovation, but I think it's a matter of when you have that kind of initial innovative step, is to really think about it from like, how will this work in a production environment, and not just this is a cool demo. Let's get this out there into the hands of people and just see how it works. I think for every project, there's a set of maybe a group of questions that are really important that they need to kind of think about and kind of answer up front. Like what type of data will be used in production, and are we allowed to use it in that way? So things like privacy and amounts like personal identifying information are important to make sure that they're not being misused in the way that the system is operating. How do we evaluate the quality and detect regressions in the system? So especially if we're looking at the long-term maintenance of it, how are we going to monitor and like observability, bring in that observability and monitoring the behavior of the system, the cost of the system, our failure modes? Those are kind of important. Identifying who's going to own the system, what teams are responsible for it, who's going to be in charge of the long-term maintenance after it ships, and what happens when it's wrong. Like, what does that look like? Is that become disastrous, or is that something that we've kind of designed for to ensure that we're kind of protected, right? So
if there's some backup plan as well,
all those are kind of elements that are really, really important in order to kind of establish a clean product, a production grade system. And I'd say, like, again, just kind of coming back to that product experience, who owns that, and who helps to kind of build that user trust? So, like, does the system explain itself to the users? Does it fail gracefully? Does it collect feedback and training data in production? Because that's nowadays one of those things where if you can get even just like a thumbs up, thumbs down, or part of the user experience is designed in such a way that you can get some signals from the user's interactions, that gives you all of a sudden really high quality data that can be used in combination with your full lineage tracking to understand what was that journey of what happened, and why did this user say this was not useful or that this was useful. And that can help kind of refine and optimize these systems kind of in a production environment as well.
Yeah, no, I think we see it all the time. ChatGPT, like, occasionally we'll always ask you which version you like better, thumbs up, thumbs down. So these are great insights, Sean. Thanks again for sharing your time and perspective. And for those listening, if you're working on bridging GenAI into production and navigating the same roadblocks, make sure to follow the podcast and feel free to reach out if you'd like to join the conversation. Thanks again, Sean.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks for having me.
Of course.